The cruelest family battles are the ones nobody else can see. I was 67 years old when I finally realized that the tension in my home was not my imagination. For years, I had convinced myself that Rebecca and I were simply different women trying to love the same family in different ways. She was modern, confident, and organized. I was traditional, cautious, and deeply attached to the routines that had carried me through 4 decades of marriage before my husband passed away. I thought our occasional disagreements were normal. Every family has them. Every mother eventually learns to step aside and allow a younger generation to build its own traditions. At least that is what I told myself. The realization came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Michael and Rebecca had invited me to lunch at their house, something that used to happen every week but had gradually become less frequent. I arrived carrying a homemade apple pie, the same recipe my husband had loved for more than 30 years. Rebecca smiled when she opened the door. Her smile was polite, perfect even, yet something about it felt rehearsed. Inside, the house looked beautiful. Fresh flowers sat on the dining table. Family photographs lined the walls. Everything appeared warm and welcoming. Yet within minutes, I noticed something strange. The newest photographs displayed birthdays, vacations, and holiday gatherings that I had never attended. There was Michael smiling beside Rebecca at a beach resort. There were the grandchildren opening Christmas gifts. There was a 4th of July barbecue filled with relatives. I stared at the pictures while pretending not to notice. Nobody mentioned them. Nobody explained them. It was as if my absence had become so normal that it no longer required discussion. During lunch, Rebecca controlled every conversation with remarkable ease. When I asked about an upcoming family reunion, she answered before Michael could speak. When I offered to help organize a birthday celebration for my granddaughter, she quickly explained that everything had already been arranged. Each response sounded kind. Each sentence appeared harmless. Yet together they formed an invisible wall. By the end of the meal, I felt like a guest observing someone else's family. Michael seemed unaware. He laughed, shared stories from work, and talked about weekend projects around the house. Watching him, I realized he genuinely believed everything was fine. That realization hurt more than anything else. After lunch, I excused myself and stepped into the backyard. The spring air felt cool against my skin. Children's toys were scattered across the grass. Wind moved gently through the trees. I stood there alone and tried to understand why I felt so unsettled. Then I noticed a small detail. Near the patio door hung a large family calendar filled with birthdays, school events, vacations, and gatherings. Several events involved the entire family. None included my name. I stared at the calendar for several seconds before quietly looking away. Nobody had erased me completely. They had simply stopped including me. That evening, I drove home in silence. The setting sun painted the streets gold as I replayed every interaction from the past 2 years. Missed invitations, short phone calls, last-minute schedule changes. Suddenly, patterns began appearing where I had once seen coincidence. For the first time, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. Instead, I started asking a different question. Why was it happening? And deep down, I already suspected where the answer might lead. The next morning, I found myself sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, staring at the calendar Rebecca had arranged on the refrigerator, my mind racing through all the small patterns I had noticed over the past months. Each event, each gathering, each birthday seemed carefully orchestrated without me, yet everyone spoke as if I had been present, as if I had agreed to be left out. I realized then that the absence was not accidental. It was deliberate. I recalled the subtle cues, the way Rebecca would glance at Michael whenever I tried to contribute to a conversation about family plans, the way she would quickly redirect topics whenever I mentioned past traditions or suggested new activities. It was not overt hostility, only a quiet, almost invisible assertion of control. That afternoon, I decided to take a closer look at the household accounts and planning documents that had always passed through Rebecca's hands. I spent hours going through statements, receipts, and notes that had accumulated in my filing cabinet over the years, noting discrepancies in expected expenses, the timing of transfers, and events that had been scheduled in my name without my knowledge. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of careful manipulation. At first, I felt a mix of disbelief and sorrow. How could someone I had welcomed into my family behave so subtly, yet so intentionally, to marginalize me? Yet, after that initial wave of emotion, a sense of clarity emerged. I understood that knowledge would give me power, that observation would become my tool, and patience my ally. For the next few days, I observed interactions quietly, noting Rebecca's subtle tactics and the way she maintained appearances with Michael. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, seemed calculated to reinforce her version of family dynamics. I remained calm, making mental notes of each instance. By the time the weekend arrived, I had gathered enough insight to begin planning a strategy. It was not a strategy of confrontation or anger, but of quiet reclamation. I organized documents, highlighted inconsistencies, and mapped out a timeline of events to understand the full scope of control Rebecca had exercised. That Sunday, when Michael invited me to brunch, I carried nothing but my observations and my notebook. I listened to every conversation, watching for patterns and testing the reactions of both Michael and Rebecca to subtle suggestions I made about future family events. With each response, I learned more about the dynamics at play, confirming what I had suspected and gaining confidence in my ability to act deliberately. As I drove home that evening, sunlight glinting off the streets of my neighborhood, I felt a renewed determination. I understood the situation fully now. I was no longer reacting blindly to exclusions. I was preparing to reclaim my rightful place within the family, using patience, intelligence, and strategy to navigate the quiet war that had been unfolding for years. By midweek, I had gathered enough insight to begin piecing together the subtle ways Rebecca had been consolidating control within our household. It started with small observations, the way she arranged family schedules so that I would always arrive after decisions had been made, the way she highlighted certain financial priorities to Michael while minimizing mine, and the carefully crafted way she presented herself as the liaison for all family matters. Each detail was deliberate, yet imperceptible to anyone who was not paying close attention. I took careful notes on each interaction, documenting not just the events themselves, but the timing, tone, and micro-expressions that accompanied them. One afternoon, while organizing the kitchen drawers where she routinely filed receipts, I discovered overlapping records of expenses and transfers that did not match what I had authorized or expected. My curiosity deepened as I cross-referenced these findings with the family calendar and previous photographs of gatherings I had missed. A pattern emerged, revealing that entire celebrations and vacations had been curated as if I had participated when, in truth, I had not been present. That evening, I decided to test my assumptions subtly. During a casual phone call with Michael, I mentioned a past holiday event in passing, one I had never attended, and observed both his reaction and Rebecca's response. Michael laughed and assumed I had forgotten attending, while Rebecca interjected with a correction, describing the event as though I had been there, carefully controlling the narrative. The realization hit me hard. It was not just omission, but active narrative manipulation. I felt a mix of disbelief and clarity. While others might have reacted with anger, I recognized that measured observation would serve me better. Over the next several days, I continued this quiet investigation, carefully monitoring conversations, studying how Rebecca influenced Michael and the grandchildren, and mapping out all discrepancies between what was portrayed and what had actually occurred. Each discovery reinforced my resolve to approach the situation with calculated precision rather than confrontation. I began organizing all the evidence, receipts, bank statements, calendars, and photographs, creating a chronological sequence that highlighted the pattern of exclusion and control. By the weekend, I had not only confirmation of my suspicions, but also a strategic plan for how to reclaim both my rightful participation in family life and the control over decisions and assets that had been subtly redirected. On Sunday morning, I prepared for a family brunch at their home, carrying only my notes and a quiet determination. I listened to each conversation, observed every interaction, and noted reactions to my subtle suggestions about upcoming events. With each observation, I grew more confident in the accuracy of my understanding and in the steps I would take next. As the day ended, I returned home with a sense of calm anticipation, knowing that the strategy was forming perfectly and that the quiet war I had sensed was about to shift in my favor. By the following week, I had organized every observation, document, and note into a coherent plan. Helen Parker, in her quiet determination, began systematically reviewing financial statements, family calendars, and past correspondence, noting every instance where Rebecca had diverted attention or resources. Each observation confirmed her suspicions: small exclusions, repeated pattern of oversight, and subtle control over household decisions, all carefully orchestrated. Helen spent long afternoons in her sunlit living room, cross-referencing old receipts with recent statements, marking dates when family events had been presented as if she had attended when she had been absent. She reflected on the holidays missed, the dinners where her chair remained empty, and the quiet moments in which her presence was never acknowledged. Helen knew that the key to reclaiming her place was patience and observation. She began engaging in subtle testing, casually mentioning previous family events, noting Michael's unassuming reactions and Rebecca's careful adjustments of the narrative. It became evident that Rebecca had constructed a parallel reality within the household, where appearances of inclusion masked deliberate exclusion. Helen's strategy remained calm and measured. She focused on collecting evidence rather than confronting anyone prematurely. Over several days, she compiled photographs, bills, and family records into a comprehensive chronology. Each piece corroborated another, slowly revealing the extent of the quiet war that had been waged for years. The children played outside, oblivious to the careful scrutiny of family dynamics indoors, as Helen arranged documents on the dining table under the warm afternoon light, creating a map of the invisible power structure that Rebecca had maintained. By midweek, Helen had developed a plan for the next family gathering, a subtle approach designed to observe, confirm, and eventually reclaim her rightful position without creating unnecessary conflict. She prepared mentally to remain composed, to let facts speak louder than accusations, and to ensure that Michael could see the reality without feeling forced into confrontation. On Sunday, Helen arrived at the brunch with a quiet confidence, carrying only her notebook and carefully organized evidence. The house was filled with the usual chatter, the smell of breakfast wafting through the air, but she noticed each glance, each gesture, each carefully framed comment Rebecca made. Helen listened, observed, and gently guided the conversation toward future plans, noting Rebecca's reactions and the small shifts in Michael's expressions. Every interaction, every minor adjustment in tone, confirmed Helen's understanding and her readiness to act. As the brunch concluded and sunlight streamed through the windows, Helen felt a growing sense of control. The plan was clear, the evidence in place, and the next steps in the quiet war defined. She drove home slowly, contemplating the series of observations and interactions that had brought her to this point, fully aware that the coming days would require tact, patience, and the calm execution of her strategy to finally restore balance and recognition within the family. The following week became the most important phase of my plan because I stopped collecting information and started measuring reactions. I knew that facts alone would not reveal everything. People often revealed far more through their responses than through their actions. On Tuesday morning, I called Rebecca and casually mentioned that I had been sorting through old family photographs. I told her I was thinking about creating a large scrapbook for the grandchildren, something that would include every major family gathering from the past 5 years. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Rebecca quickly recovered and told me the idea sounded wonderful. Her voice remained cheerful, yet I noticed a slight tension that had not been there before. That single hesitation told me more than a dozen conversations ever could. Over the next several days, I continued introducing harmless topics that referenced past events. I mentioned vacations, birthdays, and holiday celebrations. Each time, I carefully observed the responses. Michael seemed relaxed and open. Rebecca, however, became increasingly attentive whenever those subjects appeared. She often stepped in to answer questions directed at Michael. She corrected details that nobody had challenged. She volunteered explanations that nobody had requested. The more she tried to control the narrative, the clearer the pattern became. By Thursday, I decided to take another step. I invited the entire family to a small dinner at my house the following weekend. It was nothing elaborate, just a simple gathering with homemade food and a chance to spend time together. Everyone accepted. Rebecca accepted as well, though her enthusiasm sounded forced. As I prepared for the dinner, I spent hours organizing my materials. I was not preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for clarity. Photographs were arranged by date. Calendars were matched to events. Notes were placed in chronological order. Every detail supported another detail. The picture they created was impossible to ignore, yet I felt no anger while reviewing them. What surprised me most was how calm I had become. Months earlier, these discoveries would have devastated me. Now they simply strengthened my resolve. Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. I spent the morning cooking recipes that had been family favorites for decades. The scent of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filled the house. Looking around my dining room, I felt a strange sense of peace. This house had witnessed countless family milestones. It deserved honesty. When everyone arrived that evening, the atmosphere felt normal on the surface. The grandchildren laughed. Michael complimented the meal. Rebecca smiled and participated in every conversation. Yet beneath the pleasant exchanges, I sensed a subtle shift. For the first time, I was no longer reacting to events. I was guiding them. During dessert, I casually mentioned the scrapbook project again. I asked everyone if they would be willing to help identify dates and locations from old photographs. Michael immediately agreed. The grandchildren became excited. Rebecca smiled, but I noticed her fingers tighten slightly around her coffee cup. It was a small reaction, almost invisible, yet it confirmed everything. She understood that the past was about to be examined more closely than ever before. Later that night, after the family left, I stood alone in the kitchen cleaning dishes. Moonlight filtered through the window above the sink. The house was quiet. For the first time since I had begun uncovering the truth, I felt certain that the balance of power was beginning to change. Rebecca still believed she controlled the story. What she did not realize was that every attempt to protect that story was leaving a trail behind. And soon, that trail would lead exactly where I needed it to go. The week after the family dinner, I noticed something I had not seen before. Rebecca had become cautious. Not frightened, not defensive, but cautious. It showed in small ways. She asked more questions than usual whenever family plans were discussed. She seemed unusually interested in my scrapbook project. She even called me twice during the week to ask whether I needed help organizing photographs. On the surface, her behavior appeared thoughtful. To anyone else, it would have looked like kindness. But I had spent months observing patterns, and I knew this was different. Rebecca was trying to learn how much I knew. That realization confirmed that I was moving in the right direction. Rather than pulling back, I continued exactly as planned. I spent several afternoons sorting photographs across my dining room table. Some images were nearly 20 years old. Others had been taken only months earlier. Looking through them felt like traveling through time. There were birthdays, graduations, family vacations, and holiday celebrations. Yet the closer I examined the more recent years, the more obvious the pattern became. Entire chapters of family history existed without me. What troubled me most was not that I had missed events. It was that those events had later been discussed as though I had been present. Memories had been rewritten, reality had been adjusted, and somehow Michael had never noticed. On Friday afternoon, Michael stopped by unexpectedly. He brought coffee and a box of pastries from a local bakery. We sat together on the porch while a gentle breeze moved through the neighborhood. For nearly an hour, we talked about ordinary things. Work, the children, home repairs. Then something happened that caught my attention. Michael mentioned an upcoming summer trip. He spoke casually about it, assuming I already knew the details. I asked a simple question. When was this planned? He looked surprised. Months ago, he answered. Rebecca said she told you. I smiled politely and changed the subject, but inside, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Once Michael left, I wrote the conversation down immediately. It matched dozens of similar situations I had documented. Information was consistently being filtered before it reached me. Invitations disappeared. Details changed. Conversations were redirected. None of it looked dramatic on its own. Together, however, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The following Sunday brought another family gathering, this time at a local park for my grandson's baseball game. Families sat beneath folding canopies while children ran across the grass. Parents cheered from the sidelines. Grandparents shared snacks and stories. I arrived early and found a seat near the field. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes later with the children and several relatives. As always, she moved effortlessly through the crowd, greeting everyone and organizing conversations. Yet something felt different. For the first time, I noticed Michael watching her reactions. Small moments that once escaped his attention now seemed to catch his eye. When Rebecca interrupted one of my stories, I saw him glance toward her. When she answered a question directed at me, I noticed his expression change slightly. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Seeds of awareness had begun to grow. Driving home that evening, I felt calmer than I had in years. The evidence was complete. The observations were consistent. Most importantly, the truth was beginning to reveal itself without my needing to force it. Rebecca still believed she controlled every narrative within the family. What she did not understand was that once people begin noticing patterns for themselves, those patterns become impossible to ignore. That Sunday afternoon, I finally decided it was time to act on the quiet observations and evidence I had accumulated over weeks of careful attention. Helen Parker had spent countless hours sorting photographs, documents, and family calendars, each piece meticulously organized to reveal the subtle patterns of exclusion and control that Rebecca had exercised over the household. She was not angry. She was methodical, composed, and ready to let facts speak for themselves. I arrived at her home early, the spring sunlight casting long shadows across the porch where she had set up a small table to display the evidence she had compiled. Michael arrived soon after, holding a thermos of coffee, oblivious to the preparation taking place around him. Rebecca followed moments later, her expression polite, her eyes scanning the room with an undercurrent of curiosity. Helen greeted each of them calmly and invited them to sit at the dining table. She began by showing Michael the photographs first: birthdays, vacations, holiday gatherings, and everyday moments that had been presented as if she had been present when in fact she had been absent. Michael leaned forward, flipping through the images slowly, trying to reconcile what he remembered with what he was seeing. Helen explained the timeline, each photograph linked to corresponding receipts, bank statements, and calendar entries, all of which clearly indicated how decisions and events had been redirected without her knowledge. Rebecca's smile remained, but the tension in her posture became more noticeable. She made no attempt to interrupt, though her eyes darted toward Michael as Helen described each sequence. Michael's expression shifted from surprise to confusion, and finally to concern. He looked at Helen and then at Rebecca, the pieces clicking into place. Helen did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize or accuse. She presented facts with calm authority, detailing the series of omissions and manipulations in a manner that left no room for doubt. For the first time in months, the dynamics of the family were visible in their entirety, laid bare on the table before them. Rebecca's careful narrative had been dismantled by documentation and observation. The room was silent except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the quiet murmurs of Michael processing the information. Helen maintained her composure, observing both reactions, noting every detail for the next steps of her strategy. Michael finally spoke, acknowledging the oversight and expressing a desire to restore fairness and transparency. Rebecca nodded but offered no further explanations, her earlier control dissolved by the evidence before her. As the afternoon progressed, Helen outlined her plan for restoring her rightful participation in family decisions, allocating responsibility for events and financial matters in a way that would prevent future exclusions. Michael agreed with clarity and support, now understanding the subtle ways Rebecca had shaped the family narrative without his awareness. By the time the meeting concluded, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Helen felt a calm satisfaction. The quiet war that had been waged for years had reached a turning point, and the balance of power within the household had begun to tilt back in her favor, not through confrontation, but through observation, evidence, and deliberate, thoughtful action. Over the next few days, Helen Parker carefully consolidated her position within the family, using the evidence and observations she had gathered to restore her rightful influence and participation. The subtle shift in dynamics became immediately noticeable to anyone paying attention. Michael began consulting Helen on small decisions that had previously been managed entirely by Rebecca, from family dinner arrangements to holiday scheduling. He asked for her opinion on events, seeking guidance that reflected years of shared experience and understanding. Rebecca, meanwhile, adjusted her approach, still polite and composed, yet noticeably cautious. Her attempts to manage the narrative became less assertive, each comment calculated to maintain appearances rather than to control outcomes. Helen spent hours reviewing family calendars, confirming attendance at upcoming events and documenting past omissions. She arranged the evidence to tell a clear story without accusation, demonstrating patterns of exclusion while highlighting moments of miscommunication and oversight. At home, she prepared materials for future family gatherings, organizing photographs and notes to subtly reinforce transparency and shared responsibility. When the next weekend arrived, Helen hosted a small family brunch, choosing a sunny morning with clear skies. The children played in the yard while Helen arranged the dining table with care, ensuring everything was in place to create a natural, welcoming environment. As the family settled, Michael began referencing events and details he had previously discussed only with Rebecca, showing that he now valued Helen's insight and judgment. Rebecca participated, smiling, but her confidence was tempered by the awareness that the control she once exercised had been diminished. Helen guided the conversation gently, making subtle suggestions that encouraged fairness and transparency. Every interaction was observed carefully. She noted the reactions of both Michael and Rebecca to minor prompts, measuring the shift in dynamics. By mid-morning, a clear change had taken place. Decisions were now shared openly, and Helen's input was sought and respected. She maintained her composure, ensuring that every action reinforced her authority without confrontation. In the afternoon, she took the children aside to involve them in selecting photos for the upcoming family album, a simple activity that subtly demonstrated her active role in preserving family memories. Rebecca observed quietly, realizing that Helen's influence could not be ignored, and that her previously subtle manipulations were no longer effective. Michael began discussing upcoming plans with both women, openly considering Helen's perspective and suggestions. By the time the brunch concluded, the atmosphere had shifted from cautious politeness to a measured balance of respect, collaboration, and transparency. Helen felt a sense of satisfaction, recognizing that the quiet, deliberate actions she had taken over weeks had produced visible change. The family was moving toward a healthier, more inclusive dynamic, and Helen had reclaimed her position within the household through patience, intelligence, and thoughtful observation, setting the stage for the ongoing re-establishment of trust, respect, and shared authority that would guide future interactions and family events. By the following weekend, Helen Parker had reached a sense of quiet fulfillment. The strategies she had implemented over the past several weeks had shifted the dynamics of the household in subtle but unmistakable ways. She arrived early at the family home, carrying her meticulously organized scrapbook and a few old photo albums she had curated to reflect the authentic history of their family gatherings. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the kitchen and dining area in a warm glow. Michael arrived first, greeting her with an open smile and clearly anticipating the experience of seeing the preserved memories. The grandchildren ran about, laughing and chatting, and Rebecca followed moments later, her demeanor still polite but noticeably restrained. Helen began by placing the albums and scrapbook on the dining table, inviting everyone to explore the materials at their leisure. She guided Michael and the children through the photographs, pointing out events, trips, and moments that had once been overlooked or misrepresented. Her tone was calm, inviting, and measured, encouraging them to engage with the materials without confrontation. Michael asked questions, leaning in to understand dates, locations, and participants in each photograph. The grandchildren eagerly participated, identifying themselves and their cousins in pictures and sharing memories associated with each image. Rebecca observed closely, occasionally adding minor clarifications, yet it was clear her previous dominance over the narrative had diminished. Helen remained composed, gently facilitating the conversation and allowing the truth to unfold naturally. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations became inclusive, collaborative, and reflective rather than dominated by one perspective. Michael started consulting both women on plans for upcoming family events, seeking balance and fairness in decision-making. Helen's influence was now recognized and respected without the need for argument, as her careful preparation and patient observation had created an environment where the facts themselves guided the family's interactions. By midday, the family had moved to the backyard for a casual picnic. Helen noticed subtle changes in the way Rebecca interacted, less assertive, more willing to listen, and increasingly cooperative when discussing activities or responsibilities. Michael's awareness continued to grow, his attention now evenly distributed between both women. The children played freely, while Helen and Michael quietly exchanged observations about the positive shift in family dynamics. By the end of the afternoon, Helen felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The quiet war that had persisted for years had reached a natural resolution. Through meticulous observation, strategic patience, and calm assertion of truth, she had reclaimed her place in the family. She understood that power within relationships did not require confrontation or aggression. Careful attention to patterns, thoughtful planning, and measured action could restore balance in a way that fostered long-term harmony. That evening, as sunlight waned and the family gathered for a final group photograph, Helen positioned herself at the center, a symbolic yet natural placement reflecting her renewed presence. Michael stood beside her, children surrounding them, and Rebecca was included in the photograph, but the composition subtly acknowledged the restored equilibrium. Helen glanced around at the faces of those she loved, recognizing that respect, clarity, and understanding had finally been restored, and that the family story was now truly shared, accurate, and inclusive.